No, it sort of depends on how many things you have in your Wise project itself. The integration does take a little bit of space in your project, like storage space, but the actual build of the game won't take as much space. And it's very common for Unity projects to get large in size, anyways, because they use a lot of third party packages when developers are building the game. So it's common for the Unity project to go over like 4 to 5 GBs easily for even like small games. So the Wise integration itself in the Unity project will take up like at least 6 to 700 MBs of space. That does not sound much, but like with everything together inside the game, that builds up to adds up to like a lot, right? So in development process, yes, it can take a little bit of storage. In terms of memory, I don't think it's very heavy on the CPU, because the we have like systems in place inside Wise to even manage all of those things, like what type of to optimize. So like we can do conversion on our audio, so it's basically more efficient for system to work with that audio for that bit rate, or maybe compression on audio. So you can do all of those things inside Wise, and we'll always like get like a brief about what our limits should be while using this sort of integration in the game. The developer, like we have to discuss it with the developer basically to sort of understand the needs of the game. Let's look at what we are going to do today. So if you guys remember, we did some animation events yesterday. That's where we left off. We made some footstep animation events for our player character while the player is running. So just to recap that, we what we did was we added these animation nodes. Again, you can just scroll on animation of any object, and you can just right click and add an animation event on that particular frame. Once you have that animation node, this animation event is responsible to post a function, and we can define what this function does through a custom script that we add to our object. And this script, so this is the script that we have added, and this is the function that we wrote yesterday to post this Wise event, that is our player FS event. So today we are going to like look at what this line of code actually means, and we are going to talk about some basic coding concepts so you can understand better how to write these lines of codes actually. And it's not that difficult, I promise you. Like this seems very intimidating, learning this all of this language and coding logics, but we are going to discover everything that you need in order to get started with this sound implementation at least. So what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to delete this line of code that we wrote yesterday, and we're going to make a new script, a completely new script to work off of. Okay, so we're going to add a component, and we are going to just write a new script. We can name it anything that we want. So I'm going to name it new animation events. It doesn't matter how you name it, like any uppercase or lowercase does not matter. When you type in this name, the drop down will show you that there is no such object in the project already, so you have the option to create a new script. Again, we just have to make sure we name it whatever we want and just create an add that will add this script into the inspector of that object. Now this script itself, let it compile. Now this script itself is saved in our project asset folder, so we can just drag and drop that script onto any other object that we need. I'll show you in just a second. Yes, so we have this new animation event script here, and if I see in my project window, I have this created new animation script. So I can basically go to any object and I can just drag and drop that script on there, and it will be added to that object, and it will follow the same things that we define in the script. It will have the same characteristics, and it will be able to use all those functions that we have created inside the script. So we don't need this currently on this enemy simple object, so I'm going to remove it for now. Let's go back to our character, and we have this new animation script. Let's open this script by double clicking this name. Okay, so this software that I'm using here is called Visual Studio Code. This is basically a code editor that is developed by Microsoft, but you can use any other code editor if you want, if you're familiar with something. It doesn't matter which code editor you are using, they are all going to write the same code. So by default, Unity will give us this template of code that we can start with, and this template is basically used for all the scripts. These functions by default are also going to be a part of our code. These are predefined functions that Unity gives us: start and update. Now, if you remember, yesterday when we were posting our sound banks, I talked about these two things called load on start and load on awake. So these are also basically functions, and this start is the same as this start. So this only executes when the game actually starts and we can see the first screen that we can interact with. That's when this code is executed. Update, on the other hand, is executed once every frame of the game. So this anything that we write inside this will keep getting executed for every frame that the game is running continuously forever, unless we define it or unless we write a condition that it has to meet. So these two methods are given to us by default in the template, but for animation events we are not going to use this. We don't need these two functions, so we are going to delete that. Now for we are going to start with some basic concepts. So let's actually understand what a function actually is, right? So let's say we have to create a new function. A function is basically a block of code. This is how we write a new function. We can name this anything that we want, followed by a parenthesis, normal brackets basically. After that, we open curly brackets, and inside this curly bracket is what this function will execute. So a function is just a block of code that we can recall anytime that we need. So if I write anything inside here, it doesn't matter. I can write a bunch of long code, and whenever we call this function in anywhere inside our code or anywhere inside our game, this all of these lines will get executed whenever we call this. Does that make sense so far, guys? Okay, awesome. Yeah, so now we created a function for animation event, so we can create that again for this. Say footsteps function, right? and inside this we are going to write the line of code that is responsible to post an event from Wise. Let's look at that. So it's AK sound engine. I'm going to break down the each uh, word that we are writing, why we are writing this, but let's see the entire line first. Post event and the name of the event, that is player fs and game object. So Unity is working with the language called C sharp. um, the languages like which language do you learn while if you want to work with game audio? I would suggest you can start with C++. That is the language that Unreal is using, Unreal Engine, and Unity is using C sharp language. They're both based on C, so they are pretty similar. All the logic that we discussed today is applicable for C++ as well. It's only the syntax will be a little different. The way we write it is a little different. But the basic logic, we will have the same logic of functions in C sharp and C++. So, okay, this line of code is all you have to memorize in order to work with audio inside Unity. This one single line of code. This is responsible to post an event from Wise, from the AK sound engine, which Wise provides for Unity integration, and it's posting this on this particular game object that this script is inside. So we have the script on our player object. Yeah, we have this script on our player object, and this is where it will post this sound. So what is AK sound engine? AK sound engine is something called as a class in C sharp. So a class, as you can see, when we create a new script, it creates a class of that script. This is for us Unity gives us a template of this script, but for Wise integration, Audio Kinetic has already created these classes for us to use, and we can just type in AK sound engine, and they have defined multiple functions. So this post event is a function. So they've defined multiple such functions. Say we have set switch or set RTPCs. So we have like multiple such functions that belong to this particular class. And then to use those functions, we have something called as arguments. We pass these two arguments to these functions. Arguments are basically just values that we give to function in order to work with that particular function. Like this function is doing certain action. It's posting an event from Wise, and AK Sound Engine has the description or the block of code that is responsible to uh, post the event inside this function. So we reference that class dot, and we are just calling this function again post event, and we pass the name of the event as one of the arguments, and second argument that it takes is where it has to post that particular event. That is the game object that we are writing this script on. So this one line of code will be used throughout the project. Like this is the only coding that you will actually need to learn or memorize. Everything that else that we're going to look at is just a way of improving and being more efficient with your code. That's all that is needed in coding. So Also, this line of code, that AK sound engine dot post event, Unity won't have this by default. This is only available to us after we do the integration. Okay, so let's see again if this is working or not. So we created this function again, footsteps function, and yeah, let's post that again with our animation event. So you see, it automatically shows us the new script that we have created, new animation events. Inside this, there is this drop down called methods, and inside this we have the footsteps function that we create. Now, methods and functions are often used interchangeably. Like we can refer to these as functions or methods. They mean the same thing when we are working with C sharp. So if you see anybody referring to a method from a particular class, they're talking about functions basically. So these two are the same thing. So yeah, let's select that and let's play. Okay, I think it's consuming a lot of CPU on my system because I have too many apps. But okay, that's fine. Okay, let me just restart my Unity. In the meanwhile, if you guys have any questions regarding functions that we just discussed, please feel free to ask. Um, See, the Unity is responsible to make a call for those functions. That's what we call a game call. So Unity is just telling Wise ki okay, I need this particular function, this particular event posted now whenever this main function is called. Or so like there are two functions here. If you notice, like we are posting this post event function inside another function called footsteps function. This is the whole purpose of functions, that we can reuse it anywhere that we want. Once we have defined certain lines of code inside a function, we can use it throughout our project anywhere that we want. Okay, so there's this another panel that we skipped over yesterday because I wanted to discuss it today with coding so you have some context. This is called the console. This is where Unity will send us messages to tell us what is going on inside our code. Now, there are three types of messages that you can get inside the console. This first one is called a warning. This is displayed by this yellow triangle, and it only tells us things that Unity thinks can be an error, but they are not really an error. These are just warnings that we can ignore if we want to. So, having warnings is fine. Then we have messages. These are mostly through codes that are successfully executed, and Unity will tell us these things. Or we can even write in our code that we will see. We can write messages to ourselves, so we can know, okay, this block of code has been executed successfully. And this is all a way to sort of troubleshoot our logic inside the code. And finally, we have these errors. These errors are basically Unity telling us, okay, there is something wrong with your script. There is something that you need to fix inside your script before you can actually play the game. Not all errors are going to be game breaking. Like, the game will still work and run if you have certain errors. But a lot of the times, when Unity feels like, or like, if you have the wrong syntax anywhere. So let's say if I skip this semicolon here, I'll save the script. I'll go back to Unity. Let it recompile that script. And now it gives me this error that a semicolon is expected. Now this won't let me run the game until I fix this error. So this is basically a game breaking error. You see, all compiler errors have to be fixed before you can enter the play mode. While these errors were not doing that to us. These are just Unity saying like we are missing a component on this particular object. So let's go back and fix this error particular. We are going to make this semicolon on this line. Now, why do we write the semicolon? Whenever we are writing code in C sharp, we have to tell the script that this is one line of code that we want to be executed. So this one statement will end here. Then we can have multiple statements that end with more semicolons. So semicolons are important. Don't forget that. Don't miss out on those. We only write these semicolons at the end of statements. We do not write them at the end of defining functions or anything else that we are going to see later how we define things. Okay. Let's actually see how you can post a message to yourself to see that if your line of code is working. So below this function, I can simply write debug.log. Now this debug.log is a predefined function in Unity from the debug class. You can see the format of these statements are pretty similar. We have a class at the beginning, dot a function that is going to perform an action, and we pass an argument to that function. So in this case, we want to pass a text to ourselves that it is going to post in the console. So let's write something like footsteps are triggered, or something like that. Also, C sharp is a case sensitive language, so the capitalization of certain letters is important. If you miss that, the code might not recognize what you are trying to write. So we put a semicolon since this is a statement, and we go back to Unity. And let's try playing. And you will often have to like sort of troubleshoot your problems with the code. So this is where the console is your best friend. Like, you can write messages inside the blocks of code that you're executing to see if it has been executed, and sort of like judge, okay, does the sound play at the right time, or does it not play at all. So maybe you have a mistake in your Wwise event, so you go back to your Wwise and check it. So this is sort of like how you work with Unity and Wwise together while you are coding as well. Also, animation events are the most simple things that you can uh, expect to do while posting events from a game engine. So even if you're working with something like Unreal Engine or Godot Engine, they have similar things where you can create an animation event and then post a Wise event through that animation event. So it also helps you sort of get into the mindset while creating an SFX. So you start thinking, okay, can this be an animation event inside the game? Does this particular SFX uh, does this work with an animation that is made for a certain character or a certain anything inside the game, certain NPC or anything? We don't really have any game breaking errors, or it would not let us start the play mode at all. But let's clear the console for now. Let's look at some other animation events that we already have in place. So I already had this animation script that I created for this game previously. So we have a lot more functions inside this animation script. So we have something for sword slash, something for jump landing function, for dash, and for death. How do I decide these? Because once I come into the character from the drop down, I know what animations are available. But it doesn't matter if it has an animation or not. We have to sort of sometimes decide uh, from the point of view of game developer as well, because there are certain actions that will require you to implement it in a different way. So we'll see what those are as well. So something like being hit. Now being hit does have an animation. Whenever the player is hit by an enemy, this will play, but this hit sound is not being triggered here through the animation. That is because when we are working with hit sounds or something that has like a physical impact that needs a sound inside the game, that's when we use colliders or something that will help us uh, post that event as soon as two objects are colliding inside the game. So animations are usually also using that same system. When two objects collide, it's supposed to play this hit animation, but it can create a delay sometimes, like even milliseconds matters. Like you guys know, we are working with sound, even small milliseconds will matter to sort of display and sync up the sound properly with the animation. So for hit events we have something else, but for dash we have an animation event here. I'm just posting it as soon as it starts. We have something for death. So as soon as the player falls on the ground, this animation event is playing. We have something for jump, and idle has no sound, of course. This is when the player is just idle. Now if you see the function that we created earlier, this line of statement is a little different from these lines of statement. That's because we are using a variable instead of directly writing the name of the event. Now, what is a variable? So, a variable is basically a container that will store a type of data. So, we can have something like integer. Integer gives you whole numbers, so anything from 0 to basically uh, any number you want, but whole numbers. Then we have string. String will give you any text. We always write strings under quotations, so anything inside these green quotations will be a string value. This is anything text is considered a string value inside all programming languages. Then we have something called as a bool. or boolean value. Boolean value will only give you either true or false. And finally, we have something called as float value. Float value is basically integers with decimal points. So if you want 10.50, we need to fine tune some certain value. It can be anything like player's health, any even small decimal values matter in that aspect. So we use float values instead of integer values. But these are all the data types that a variable can store. Now, how do I define a variable? In a very similar way that we define a function, we just have to write the type of data. So int, that stands for integer, and I can define any name that I want. So this is variable 1 or anything, variable new, and then I can assign a value with equals to that variable. So it says 10. We can do similar things for different data types. So we can just write string new string. This name does not matter. You can write any name that you want, and I can just store in quotations any value that I want. So it doesn't matter what value. So this is how we can work with variables as a storage component. Now, why do we need this? Because variables can help simplify your values basically. So any values that you are getting inside a code, such as this event name, can be stored inside a variable that we can reference to again if we want inside the code. So let's create a let's create a variable. Actually, we define variables at the very start of the code, before we write any functions, before we write any start or any update functions. We define variables. So I can write something like public string footstep event, and I will assign that variable the string value of player fs. Now we defined this variable as string, and we assigned it the value player fs. This public here means that we can now access this variable. If I save this script, now we can access this variable in our inspector of the script. Let's see that. So we go to draw character, and now if you see in our new animation script, there is a new field that we just created, this variable called footstep event, and now it gave us an input field for this particular variable. Now it says player fx here because we gave it a value by default, that is player fs. But if we change any value here, it will consider that value instead of whatever is set in the script. So anything we write here is going to be the value of our event name, and then all we have to do is call this variable instead of this value that we hard coded inside our AK sound engine statement. So here I can just call footstep. You see, even it even gives me a suggestion to, if you want to use that particular variable. I'll say yes, and now this statement is responsible for calling this variable on this game object, and this variable has the value of our event name. So it will post player fs on this game object basically. And again, why we are using variables in the first place? So we don't have to go back inside the code every time that we have to make a change. We can simply just say whatever value we want in here in the inspector. You see, I've done very similar setup for the previous animation script that we have, and now our code also matches exactly how we are setting it up in this script. So for attack source slash function, we are using this variable called source slash, and this variable is storing the value of the event name of the wise event. Also, you can perform operations on variables. This is an interesting thing to understand because, say, if I have a variable and I assign it a value, I can perform operations on that value. So, any mathematical or any kind of operation, such as I can just say, sorry, I can just say whenever this function is executed, I want number one to be um, number 1 plus 1. So all this is doing is incrementing the number by 1 every time this function is being executed. So every time this function is called in the Unity animation event, it will increase this 10 by 1. So actually we should do this 0. So we basically have a counter here. So in the console, we can also write something like, we'll just copy this line. So you can write something like footsteps count plus the current value of the variable number 1. So what this is doing is, when this function gets executed, it will post the event. It will write us a debug log statement of footsteps are triggered. It will take the value of this variable that is currently 0 and add to 0, add 1 to it. So this becomes 1, and then it's taking that value of 1, storing it inside this variable, and then we can call that variable again inside a debug.log statement to know what this current value of this variable is. So this will continue every time this function is called. So it will store. So we are starting with default 0. So it will store 0 here, and it will add 1. Then it will store 1 on this variable. Then when it executes again, it will take that 1 and add 1 to it again. So it becomes 2 the next time it executes. So this is basically a basic counter, just to demonstrate how we can perform certain operations using these variables. So this also helps us sort of troubleshoot our audio problems if we want to have certain audio that is being played multiple times and we have to keep account of certain things. So this is a very good way to sort of use variables in that situation. um, let's see if I can actually play the game right now. No. Let's use the function that I created earlier. Okay, I made changes while in the play mode, so it's going to revert back. That was my mistake. But we are using animation events fs function. Okay, it should work. Okay, it's working. Well, the footsteps are playing at least. Let's see why our we can take these lines of codes. Now, what I did was basically change the animation event that we made here, and I just selected the animation event that we already had in our previous script. So I'm going to just copy and paste the lines of codes that we just wrote, and I can also I've already created a variable here as well, number one, and its default value is 0. Let's see if this counter actually works inside the code once we start listening to the footsteps. Now, also, another thing to keep in mind is that although this particular script is now we are using this on player character, but all the other enemies are also using the same animation that is for run. So even if I just selected the animation event, if I just created this animation event node on a player character, since the enemies are using the same animation, they will also have the same animation event that we applied on that animation. So they are using the same function fs, but I've assigned the fs function as a to use a variable instead of a hard coded event value. So when you go to the scripts of this object, you can change the value individually for each object basically. So for my player, I'll write player fs, but for my enemies, I will have this set as enemies fs. So this will use the value of enemy fs event. If I just had this as the value of player fs, what I would have to do is create another function for enemies footsteps to use. So I will have to like duplicate this and write another function with a different name, but it contains the same lines of code but with a different value. So instead, what we have done is made it efficient. We just write one function and we just created a variable instead of where the value of the event is supposed to be. Now, this variable can be changed individually for different objects, even though they are using the same script, even though they are posting the same function. Yeah, so that is the whole point of learning the basics of the code. See, once you understand this is exactly what I want you guys to learn. Now you can think about how you can make this even more efficient in that way. You can create a different function. You can like I'm pretty sure there is a way to create a system where we just line where we just have to write one single function, and we can basically add as many fields as we want inside the inspector itself, and just name it whatever we want and give it a default value. uh, but that gets into territory where we have to look at more syntax, where we have to like understand more things into the language, how the language itself works and communicates with other uh, parts of that same script. So there's a way to do that as well, but for now we just want to keep it as simple as possible while also not being very basic about it. So this is the most efficient way to do it if you're just learning about coding languages, but of course there's a way to always make it more efficient. Now in coding it doesn't always have to be that efficient. If this works for us for this particular project, it works. There's no reason to think more about it, but that's just depends on the project itself and sort of how the developer wants it to be done. That all depends on the project. So okay, we were going to check if the counter works. My bad. Let's play and see on the console what it displays. Okay, so our counter is working, but as I said, I'll just stop this. As I said, the enemies are also using the same script, so the footsteps are being counted for them as well. So you'll see there are multiple incrementations, but it's a constant incrementation by a value of one single number. But there are like multiple entries because there are multiple enemies in our scene that are using the same script. So we have at least 7 enemies, and they're all using the same footsteps script. Same, so they are all executing this code. We don't need this for now, so I'm going to delete this. Can a function be called in another function, like a group of functions are called in a function that we? Yes, we can actually do that. So Aniket's question is basically if we can call like a function inside a function so that we can group multiple functions together and call them together. So if we have a function inside which we are calling more functions, so function 1. So now there's this function that has multiple other functions inside it. These functions could have been defined earlier in the code or anywhere else in the game. So we are calling those functions inside this function. Now I can call this function anywhere that I want. So I can even call this in this footsteps function. I'll just say function new, and now it will execute all of this code along with this function which is responsible to execute more functions inside it. So it will do all of that if we just call this one function. So I hope that answers your question. Also, one last thing before we close off for the day. We when we define the function, we often write void to define it. What is the meaning of void? Now, void is telling Unity, it's telling C sharp that this function will not return any value once it has finished executing the code inside it. So anything that it executes, it will not return any value. Like there would be no residual values that we have to expect from this function. So Unity will execute this code and just move on to the next line of code that it has to work with. It will not wait for any value that is to be returned from this function. If we want some certain value, there is another way to write that function, and then we can use whatever value that we get out of that function. We can maybe store it in a variable and use it somewhere else. So like there are multiple ways to use this function as well. We are not going to be working with that a lot. We just have to remember that our functions that we need to post with these AK sound engine events, we are not expecting any value to be returned to us. We're just telling it, okay, I want to post this function in the Wise. That's it. We don't want any residual value out of it. So we write it as void and the name of the function. But that's pretty much it for functions and variables. These are two very basic coding concepts that I introduced you to today, and these concepts are not limited to C sharp and Unity. Or like these are translated into different languages like C++ or even Python. Something like Python also uses the concept of functions and variables. It's all basic building blocks of any programming languages. You don't have to worry about learning this syntax right away. That's totally understandable if you don't know how to write this code. or like how exactly to like frame it. You can always check online references or any documentation to see how exactly it is written, but it's more important to learn the logic behind how we are writing this code, what we are actually doing with this piece of code. So next week what we'll discover is how to work with these scripts that are already inside this game. So there's a lot here. So we sort of we'll sort of understand what we are looking for when we are working with a code that is already a part of the game that is written by somebody else. So what we need to look out for and how we can use that to post whatever we want from inside this script. So if you see, like, I have more lines of codes that are posting more events here, and I've already made sort of comments of what they are doing. So we will look into all these as well. So they are mostly responsible for playing hit events, or if you see, I'm also changing RTPC on ambience here. We'll see how to do that as well. I'll explain more about the Wise side of things, how ambience is set up, how RTPCs are set up, and we'll see how to like dynamically control RTPCs. So that is planned for next week. And again, if you guys are interested, we are planning an audio jam next month. So look forward to that as well. And we'll catch up next week.